this is Hua. I am so glad to be back here today to enjoy another great day with you. Today I will be reading to you a short novel that I wrote many moons ago. It is titled Lethal Kisses. And if you have not subscribed, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I hope you enjoy the story. Never again would she allow anyone to hurt her the way he had. Her heart had been smashed into pieces, and it took her nearly 2 years before all the pieces were formed together. Never again. Kristen Landau stared at the limo waiting for her and removed the sunglasses from her heart-shaped face. It revealed dark eyes with long lashes and a face carved by angels. Her bow-shaped lips were painted a pink gloss, and she had on a stern, determined look to change her future. She knew who sent the limo, and there was no way in hell she was getting back in. Straightening her posture, she grabbed the suitcase and hailed a cab. The driver from the limo got out and walked around to her. "Mrs. Stetter, he asked me to pick you up," he said. Kristen turned to face him and gave her the most genuine smile. "Look, I know you're just doing your job, but I am no longer Mrs. Stetter in life or on paper. Our divorce was finalized 6 months ago. I don't know how he found out where I was, but you tell him that if he should not contain his distance, he will find himself slapped with a restraining order and my grandfather on his ass." Fuming still, she got into the cab, slammed the door, and told the cab to drive away. How dare him? Kristen rubbed the bridge of her nose and sighed deeply. The night sky of downtown St. Paul spoke volumes of youngsters coming out to party the nightlife. The weather was actually nice, considering that it was already the beginning of October. Kristen pulled the sweater around her as she moved from the balcony into her newly renovated condo. It was costly, but she fell in love with it. When the morning sun stirred, she could catch its beauty asking her to enjoy it. She adored the granite countertops, the red oak cabinets, and the hardwood floors. But what she loved most was the kitchen. It would make any chef across the nation drool with envy. She loved to cook, and when she saw it, she knew she had to get it. Her job as an executive assistant covered the rent, and the money she got from the alimony settlement helped her put on a new start on her life. Alimony. She hated the word, but it had gotten to the point where she had to draw the line. 8 years of her life with Leonard Stetter, a man who she thought she loved. But as it turned out, he only loved the money her grandfather had provided for them when they married. Both her parents died when she was just 2 years old and left her in the care of her grandparents. Her grandmother died when she was 10, and her grandfather raised her. He was still as strong as an ox and worked as a judge in the district court. That man could make anyone give up their life by staring at them. Cornwin Landau was not a man you wanted to mess with. He left a record of fear wherever he went. Leonard. God, that name would never make her sit right ever again. She'd met Leonard in her senior year of college and fell madly in love with his eyes and charm. He was one who made her see the world in a whole new light. Her grandfather had warned her of men like Leonard, but she didn't listen. She felt he didn't understand what she had found. When Leonard proposed, she accepted after a year of dating. They married, bought a house, and she got a job working at Leonard's family's company. Things were perfect until he began taking long trips out of the country. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then, when his company began failing, she knew something wasn't right. The big showdown came when she realized she'd left an important document at the office and had to make a trip back. There, on the floor of his office, she found Leonard and his secretary, Joan, going at it like rabbits. To top it off, Joan was the mother of his 2 children. Everything disappeared from there, and she went home crying to her grandfather. He came after her, of course, he did. For 4 months straight, he came after her, begging, pleading, anything to get her back. She never cared. Her heart had been broken to pieces, and every time she looked at him, all she saw was Joan underneath him. She packed her bags and left without another word. But licking her wounded heart took almost 2 years to heal. Every time she thought about what she gave up, 8 years of her life, she cried. She thought of how he had loved her beyond life at one point, and she cried again. Actually, she got pretty good at crying. That was all she did at one time, and her grandfather threatened to put her away. Only when she realized that her not moving on meant to Leonard that she was still in love. So one day, she closed up the box and shoved it down the trash bin. The moment she did, Kristen realized that her self-worth was returned to her. The strength she thought had drained from her bounced back with so much force she couldn't begin to describe it. Life was going to be all right. The phone rang, distracting her thoughts. She reached for it. Hello? Kristen, dear, what time will you be here tomorrow evening? Her grandfather's deep voice boomed from the other side. She laughed and settled down on the couch, curling her legs underneath her. I'll be there at 7. Did you want me to bring you anything? Just your smile. Oh, by the way, my friend's son will be in town tomorrow night. I've asked him to come for dinner. It's not to set you up or anything. He is actually friends with Leonard for quite some years. Kristen frowned. Are you talking about Gaylin? Yes. Have you met him? No, Leonard was always talking about him because they did business together, but I've never met him actually. And I didn't know that he was your friend's son. A little omission from me, I'm afraid. He will be there tonight for business purposes. Kristen shrugged. That's fine. Well, she thought, it doesn't matter. From what Leonard had always talked about, that guy seemed like he was old anyways.
The final call in the middle of the night. We sit and watch the stars. So what's the problem? Tell me all your worries.
Pulling out her favorite white dress, she entered the meeting boardroom. She had some documents for her boss, Sean Otto, to sign. She pushed open the door and a figure dressed in a 3-piece black suit stood before her. She came to an abrupt halt that her heel caught in the carpet and she lost her balance. Before she knew it, she was on her knees, the document in her hands flying to the ground. She kept her head down, afraid he'd see her blush, as she collected the papers. But the pair of expensive shoes that walked toward her told her that she had no escape but to look up. And up she looked until her gaze fell on a pair of soft, pale blue eyes that sparkled a jolt of heat into her heart. For the second time in her life, she lost her balance and ended up flat on her bottom. He bent down and offered his hand to her. She quickly recovered and stood up without the help of his hand. When she stood to her height, she realized he was still a foot taller than her. His large hands immediately stuffed themselves in his pockets as a grin appeared on his handsome face. She noticed the small scar right above his eyebrow and how his dark locks were brushed with care. His skin was darker than most, and he had a very strong square jaw. A strong scent of male floated to her nostrils and danced its way into her soul. She prayed nothing could go wrong from here because her heart was pounding like crazy. Are you all right? He asked with a thick British accent. She blinked and realized he was talking to her. At a loss of words, she only nodded and tried to come up with something, but her mind drew a blank. She heard a voice, and Sean walked into the room. Ah, Kristen, just the woman I wanted to see, he said. Without speaking, she handed the papers to him and turned on her heels. She knew she was being rude, but she had to get out of there because she found her breath had lodged itself into her throat. She had never been this moved by a man before, not even Leonard. Fear settled into her heart, and she knew she had to stay far away from him. With the thought of the stranger still in her mind, she was surprised she arrived at her grandfather's house alive. All day long she thought of the stranger whose voice was like silk, with an accent that made the female parts of her groan like no tomorrow. She shook her head. Unbelievable that this man had that kind of effect on her. She made the mistake of falling too fast for Leonard, and that was how he had ended up hurting her. She parked her car and got out. Her grandfather lived in Minneapolis, along Lake Calhoun, in a beautiful Victorian home. He'd inherited from his parents, and when her father was alive, he grew up there. She barely remembered her parents, but her grandfather was a great storyteller and told her many, many stories. She was thankful for his presence because he was all she had left. She knocked on the door, and he answered wearing his favorite gray and white striped plaid shirt with a pair of black pants. His blue eyes sparkled, and he opened his arms to her. She hugged him and walked in, noting the smell of his signature dish, the Cornish hens. Her stomach rumbled as he closed the door, and she walked in, hooking her arm through his. Her grandfather, Corwin, was a tall, strong man for his age of 70. He sported white hair, but was still fit and trimmed to the waist, thanks to the many miles he still ran and the workout he kept up with his trainer. He would tease her that she would probably age faster than him. She believed him. At 32, she felt as if she would. "I smell Cornish hens," Kristen said. "Yes, I know it's your favorite dish." She laughed. "It certainly is, Grandpa." The words died on her lips as she rounded the corner to the dining room. Sitting at the table, waiting for her, was the stranger she'd met earlier today. He'd taken his jacket off and was wearing the black vest and white button-down shirt. He stood up when she entered, and her grandfather ushered her in. "Gaylin, meet my granddaughter, Kristen. This is Gaylin Amethyst, my good friend's son." She felt her hands trickle with sweat, and she forced a smile as the man named Gaylin stared deep into her eyes. He gave her a smile that made her knees weak, and she stumbled forward. He caught her, and she pulled away too fast. He saw a flicker across his eyes as she straightened herself. "Hi," she said as she kept her hands at her sides. "I've heard a lot about you." His eyes softened. "As I've heard many good things about you." Kristen turned to her grandfather and suddenly felt as if her stomach was going to hurl. "Grandfather, I'm so sorry I can't stay for dinner. I'm not feeling well." Corwin frowned and reached for her elbow. "What's wrong?" I'm not feeling well. I'd hate to hurl during dinner. If you excuse me, I'll just be going." Gaylin stepped forward. "If you're not feeling well, perhaps you shouldn't drive home. I'd be happy to drive you home." That was not what she wanted at all. No, thank you." "Actually, that's a good idea," her grandfather chipped in. "If you're not feeling well, I don't want you to risk yourself driving. Gaylin can take you home and we can take a rain check on dinner." Kristen shook her head. "No, Grandfather, don't do that. You went to all this work just to prepare dinner. I feel really bad. Please stay and keep my grandfather company. I assure you I'll call you when I get home." Her grandfather laughed. "Kristen, why do I get the notion you're running away?" "Come on, my dear child. If you can drive home, then you can stay for dinner. I worry about you too much. Sit down." It was not something to argue with. She watched as he disappeared into the kitchen, and she stood as Gaylin watched her with his blue eyes. She swallowed hard and took a step backward as he came forward to her. He saw her reaction and smiled. "I was merely going to help you remove your coat," he said. "I can do it just fine." She removed her purse and coat, and then she came to sit down at the dining table. He took his seat and watched her. When she looked up, her grandfather had made his way back in with dinner. This was going to be a very, very long dinner. Gaylin was watching her as she sat talking to her grandfather outside on the balcony. Everything about this woman sparked an interest in him. He'd never been so surprised in his life. First, when he laid eyes on her, his heart pounded so hard he was afraid she'd hurt it. Second, running into her twice in one day made him really begin to believe things happened for a reason. He was glad he had accepted Corwin's invite to dinner. Now he could finally put a face to the name Kristen. For years, his father had talked about Corwin's granddaughter and what a beauty she was. He knew that she had married Leonard, his friend, but because he wasn't in the state as often as he'd like to be, he'd never met her. But the gods was on his side, because before she showed up, Corwin had mentioned that she divorced Leonard. At first, he didn't really care about Corwin's daughter. A part of him felt that he had invited him just to hook him up with his granddaughter, because all day long he thought of the woman with the dark hair and eyes like dark chocolate pools and legs that was meant to wrap around his waist. He couldn't stop thinking about her. And then she walked into his life for the second time. He heard her laugh, and the sound embedded itself deep into his soul. The sound tickled him in places he thought was long dead. But life was unraveling right before him. He couldn't let it go. He waited until Corwin came inside and up the stairs before he walked out. She was fumbling with her phone and mumbled something as he entered. "Grandfather, do you have an iPhone charger? My phone, just totally died on me," she said as she turned around. Once again, he'd stunned her silent. She closed her mouth and turned away as he came to stand beside her. "Why do I get the feeling that you don't like me?" he asked. She turned around to face him. "I don't know you well enough to answer that question." "Exactly, Kristen. You don't know me well enough, yet you've somehow established how you should react to me." She softened. "I'm sorry if I've been rude to you. It's been a long time since I've even talked to another male besides my grandfather, so I'm kind of out of the loop. I apologize." He knew what she meant. "Is that your way of saying you're sorry for being so rude to me?" Kristen looked away. "I wasn't rude." Gaylin laughed. "I beg to differ. When you met me earlier today, you refused to shake my hand." "Would shaking your hand make all of this go away?" "Indeed it will." He watched as she extended her hand out to him. A wicked smile spread across his face as he took her hand, and with one pull, he had her on her feet, and another tug had her in his arms. The impact when she landed in his arms made all the male parts of him ignite with life. She smelled of jasmine and vanilla. She was soft and perfect. Every part of him longed to hold on to her, but it only lasted a few seconds longer until she shoved him off and stumbled backward. She shot him an angry look and walked inside as he grinned. The night wind had died down, but the cars traveling outside were still loud. Gaylin gathered together the necessary paperwork needed for tomorrow's meeting and set it aside. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Thoughts of a certain dark-haired woman entered his mind, and he smiled. It had certainly been an evening he'd enjoyed more than most. He was now certain he was going to be extending his stay in the States. His family had one of the largest design companies in the world and had recently opened up a firm in Minnesota. In England, they owned half of the hotels. A lot of the people knew them by name, and not to mention, he was the third Duke of Amethyst Manor. He had a pretty good life, even if loneliness bothered him at times. Loneliness. He could get any woman he wanted, really. But his heart had turned stone cold after the woman he thought who was supposed to love him left him. He remembered how long it took him to get his head straight again. His mother had feared that he would take his own life, but he wasn't that far gone. Gaylin shoved it all away when he realized how stupid he'd become. Now he knew that nothing could have made it work, and now someone else was beginning to look like a better opportunity for him. He knew where she worked. He had been there just the day before when he was closing the account with her boss. He could simply say he had a meeting with Sean, and she'd believe him. He had been sitting in Sean's office for about 10 minutes when the door opened and she walked in. Today, she wore a black pencil skirt with a red button-down shirt and nude pumps. Her hair was down, and just as he thought, it was long and beautiful. She came to a sudden stop when she saw him, and he stood up, buttoning the front of his blue suit jacket. She set the papers down and turned to go when he called after her. "Why are you always in a rush to get away from me?" Gaylin asked. Kristen turned around and laughed. "I've got work to do." "Oh, and that makes it okay for you to be rude toward me." "Rude? Again, with that term. I'm not rude. I'm simply in a hurry." She paused and crossed her arms. "Wait, what are you doing here? Sean isn't even here today." Gaylin smiled. "Who says I'm here for Sean?" He had to admit his recovery remark was better than he expected, but the look on her face said she didn't buy it. He strolled toward her and put his hands in his pockets for fear that he may end up touching her. "Kristen, come on. Why are you trying to ignore this attraction between us? I can see it in your eyes, the effect I have on you. If you would just admit it, we can both go get a drink and see where that leads to," Gaylin said. She laughed. "I'm staying far away from you, Gaylin." "Why?" "One," she said, raising a finger, "you're the type of man that screams no attachment. Two," she said, adding another finger, "I'm done with men who look like you. They scream heartbreak." "Well, how would you know that? Because you married Leonard? You know, he spoke a lot about you to me. I never pictured you to be like this. You're a lot better than he gave you credit for. I also heard what the asshole did. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize on his behalf, Gaylin. It's tacky in my eyes. I got over him, and I'm not in any rush to start anything else with anyone, especially you." The day had ended, and Kristen was tired as hell. She longed to get home and soak in her tub and lose herself. She was just heading out when her cell phone rang. She dug through her purse and saw her best friend, Patty Jones, calling. "Hello, Patty. You better be telling me that you're getting your ass on a plane home." "I'm at your place. Hurry back so I can tell you all about what I did in Sin City." Laughing, Kristen replied, "Be there soon. No naked photos in my condo." Getting into her car, she hopped on I-94 and drove home. Patty and her had been best friends since college when Patty found her making love to the toilet after drinking a spiked punch. The two had seen each other through marriage and divorce. Patty's ex-husband had left her for a younger ass 2 years ago. Since then, Patty had changed her life around by making new bucket lists and gaining tenure at the University of Minnesota. She was now a changed woman. As soon as Kristen walked into her condo, Patty hugged her tightly, wearing leggings and a red sweater dress. She looked younger than her 34 years, and the newfound highlights in her hair caught her eyes. Patty was thin, but shorter than Kristen, but her heart was more beautiful than you could ever imagine. After settling on the couch with 2 wine glasses, Patty asked her how her week was. It was fine, actually," she said. Patty raised a brow. "Fine? Since when is your work week fine?" "What do you mean?" Patty lowered her legs to the ground. "Kristen, if you are holding back on me, I swear to God, I will call your grandfather." "What? Are you insane?" "No, but I can get there real fast." Kristen sighed and shrugged. "I told you about Leonard's friend, Gaylin, before." "And so?" "I met someone this week, and he swept me off my feet. Literally, he was like a sex god on legs." Patty began fanning herself and then stopped. Wait. What does this have to do with Gaylin?" "It's Gaylin." Patty's mouth dropped open. "Gaylin is the sex god?" Nodding, Kristen said, "Yes. I'd never met him before, and he just drew me into him. And then my grandfather told me about Gaylin visiting for dinner, and I went over and it was the same man I felt pulled to." "How does he feel?" "The same." Wait. Okay, so you both feel the same, but you're not doing anything about it. Am I missing something here?" He wants to pursue it. It's clear he does. But I don't want to. Patty made a face. Don't look at me that way. That's how I got into trouble with Leonard. I fell so hard, so fast for him that when he broke my heart, he literally broke me. I can't do that again. Patty touched her arm. Why are you still doing this to yourself? It's been 2 years, honey. You should not be hurting yourself over what that asshole did. It's time you learn to explore yourself. If you feel pulled to Gaylin, you should go after it. I don't want to because I'm still scared he'll hurt me. I'm not 100% sure I could recover it if it was Gaylin who hurt me. Will you promise me something? Will you promise me that no matter what happens, you will not let yourself become distant from true love? Thank you so much for listening to Lethal Kisses. I will be back tomorrow to read to you what happens in part 2.